All right, good evening, all, and thank you for joining us. Dr. Stephanie Pink-Harper is an associate professor in the Master of Public Administration program in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration here at UAB. She is an Alabama native, born and raised in what used to be the small rural town of Auburn, Alabama. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Criminology and Public Administration and a Master's of Public Administration, both from Auburn University. She obtained her Doctor of Philosophy from Mississippi State University in Public Policy and Administration. Her research agenda is interdisciplinary, as are the fields of public policy and public administration. The central theme and aim of her research is identifying comprehensive theoretical frameworks that enhance the quality of life in local communities and in the workplace organization. One question she examines under this theme is what economic growth and development strategies can be used as tools to enhance the quality of life in underexplored rural communities to sustain and revitalize their economies. Her research also seeks to identify ways to enhance the quality of life for public servants in the workplace. She focuses on identifying ways that the workplace environment can enhance the quality of life for public servants from marginalized groups. Her research has been published in the American Review of Public Administration, Journal of Public Management and Social Policy, Public Budgeting and Finance, Canadian Journal of Administrative Sciences, Journal of Health and Human Service Administration, the International Journal of Public Administration, and Economic Development Quarterly. As an African-American woman growing up here in the Deep South, Dr. Pink-Harper's topic on policies affecting African-Americans in America is one that resonates with her personally as a child of parents who grew up during integration. She and her husband are parents to two beautiful girls, Savannah Grace, age 5, and Reagan Mackenzie, 21 months. I present to you Dr. Stephanie Pink-Harper.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Josephat. I appreciate you in more ways than you'll ever know. I want to personally thank you first before we begin for extending the invitation to me. She reached out to me and asked me if I would present during Black History Month. And I was a little nervous at first, and we sat down and we talked and had sent a few emails here and there, and she helped to ease some of my anxiety. But thank you for this invitation and for this opportunity. And thank you to each of you as well for taking time out of your schedules to be here, as well as to the Zoom audience. What has turned out to be, fortunately, a beautiful Thursday. We had to reschedule due to the inclement weather potential last week. So I thank you all for spending some of your sunny Thursday here with me to talk about politics that affect African Americans. So as she mentioned, I am Dr. Pink-Harper, Associate Professor in the Political Science and Public Administration program. And today I'm actually going to talk on the topic, as she mentioned before, policies that affect African Americans or Blacks in America. So just to kind of give you an overview of some of the topics that I'll be discussing, we're going to start out kind of with a basic introduction, why we're here, why it's important for us to examine this topic, and specifically look at this question of the role of Black History Month and its importance. Then I'll talk specifically about the role of public policies in America, and then look specifically at some different forms of public policy to kind of help give us some context to understanding some of these different examples that we'll explore here. We'll look at statutory legislation, administrative laws, and then some court decisions. And then we will talk about the relevance and importance of these topics as it relates to right here, our own backyard, the context of Birmingham. And then we'll take some time and look at some specific examples of public policies across America in a number of different areas. We'll look at housing policies, economic development, transportation, voting policies, criminal justice, as well as some workplace or employment-based policies, and conclude, and then hopefully save some time for questions. So why are we here? Why is this important? I think it's important for us to begin this discussion by talking about Black History Month and its importance. Many of you have probably already heard about this throughout the the events that have been hosted by the Institute for Human Rights. But I wanted to kind of give some discussion or give some time to that, as it is important for shaping our discussion here today. So we didn't begin to recognize this idea of Black History Month until it was introduced as a topic of discussion by Dr. Carter G. Woodson back in 1926. And at that particular time, he was really trying to advocate or give an opportunity for us to recognize the contributions of African Americans across our society, because that was something that had been previously neglected. And so at that particular time, it was only a week. It was referred to as Negro History Week. And it was during the time period to recognize, okay, thank you, the birthday of Abraham Lincoln, as well as the birthday of Frederick Douglass. But it wasn't until about 50 years later that we actually recognized Black History Month as what we know today. And that was under the administration of President Gerald Ford. So 50 years later, 1976. So we've been doing this in terms of recognizing the contributions of African Americans across our society since 1976. So let's talk about the role of public policies in America. As I mentioned before, when I had the conversation with Mrs. Jehoshaphat, when she reached out to me and asked me if I would talk about this, she asked me to initially look at it from the lens of politics and how politics shapes the lives of African Americans. But I mentioned to her that from my world and from my perspective in the field of public administration and public policy, we try not to, even though there is some connection, but we look at government and how government operates, and more specifically through the lens of public policy, we're looking at the actions of government, right? And so I wanted to provide us with two basic definitions that I think will be helpful for shaping our discussion. The first one dates back to Thomas Dye and his work on public policy. Dye defines public policy as this: anything a government chooses to do or not to do. Pretty broad, right? But since then, other scholars have noted, and particularly Kraft and Furlong, take that a step further and they expand it to recognize it as government's actions as well as inactions in response to public problems, right? So there's some expectation in our society that something needs to be done. There's a major issue. Society's talking about it, voters are concerned, we get these issues to the right people. And so the expectation is that because we've recognized this as being an important issue, then government needs to do something. And so that's where we are today. So when I use the concept and when I use the term public policy, please note that I'm going to use that term very loosely for government's actions or the lack thereof as they relate to public problems. When we talk about public policies, I'm using the term very loosely, very broadly here, right? And once government officials are expected, as I stated before, there is an expectation that they will carry out the will of the people who are elected, right? There's this expectation. Do something, do something. We've got a societal demand. And so for our discussion today, I'm going to be using the term public policy, as I stated before, or policies very interchangeably to really talk about laws, rules, regulation, or government response to these public problems. It did something. Let's see. Okay, all right, so let's look at some of the different categories or ways in which government can respond to some of these public problems. Typically what we see are statutory laws, right? These are the things that are passed by Congress, typically in the form of a federal law where Congress goes in. If you remember back to your I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill, that whole process, I remember it so long ago. But I remember that process, and that's what we're talking about, right? Those are the types of legislation that are passed by Congress. We also have executive orders, which are going to be a category that we're going to talk about pretty extensively here today, because oftentimes, as you recall, when bill is sitting on the Hill, takes a long time, right? He's just sitting there waiting and pondering and waiting and pondering. So oftentimes what's used to resolve or attempt to address these issues are through executive orders. These are written by presidents, they're written by governors, a chief executive, and they typically have the force of law to some extent, but they are used as a way for that chief executive to manage the operations of government. There's debate and discussion about these executive orders, but they typically have the force of law, and they are only applicable to the governing body in which they are the boss of, or the chief executive, right? Also, administrative laws in the world of human resource management, we talk a lot about these. These are government agency regulations that are signed into place through the federal registrar, and they are used as a way to establish or to enforce a law. And then court decisions. We won't go through these today, but you have a number of different court decisions where the court has issued a decision or an opinion in regards to a particular topic. Other concepts are things that we're not going to talk about, but de jure versus de facto segregation, and those are largely important as well, but we can bring those back up at the end of our discussion if needed. So let's talk about the public problem. When we're talking about issues, policies that affect African Americans, I was trying to find a way to categorize and to synthesize this information, and I was thinking, okay, well, I want to say ideal timing, but what's happening right here in Birmingham, we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement. So let's take a look at some of the actions that have taken place. What was going on, right? There was unrest. There were concerns about injustices that African Americans were facing in jobs, right? So it was, if they were in jobs, they were in regards to housing, a number of different issues. So understand the context of the public problem. Let's look at some of the key actors, because they're really important and influential in getting this agenda pushed and getting it to the hands of legislators as well as presidents to put these public problems or address these public problems. This one is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? Very instrumental in shaping the civil rights movement right here in Birmingham. Pastor Fred Shuttlesworth, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. What was taking place? We had all of these key influential actors that were involved: peaceful protests, sit-in demonstrations, economic boycotts, right? We know about what's happened, not just here in Birmingham, but in Montgomery as well, with these economic boycotts, marches on City Hall, as well as the Children's Crusade March, right? So we're talking about a large demographic of African Americans that were involved. And that was an attempt to show the importance of us addressing these issues of injustice. And I put particularly the Children's Crusade March because it led to some other events, but it's important to show that there were a range of this particular demographic that were letting their voice and their concerns be heard, that we needed government to do something. And the outcomes, right? 3 unfortunate events. The A.G. Gaston Motel was bombed. Also, the 16th Street bombing, where 4 little girls or Sunday school were killed. And then the one that received a lot of national attention and really was important for leading us to some other events as well were the violent attacks ordered by Bull Connor here in Birmingham. All of those things, all of those events were important in shaping the landscape of this issue as being relevant and needing to be addressed by government. And so one of those, all of these things led up to the March on Washington of 1963. So we had these events taking place right here in Birmingham, which led to the March on Washington. As I stated before, this was about civil rights abuses. This was about jobs. This was about employment discrimination. So there was a lot of discussion taking place surrounding these issues, which, as we see here through this illustration, what resonates with most of us when we see or we think about the March on Washington is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. So we framed and we know what public policy is, right? So it's all about government's action, government's response, or their decision not to. And that's important to know. I want to stress that. If government decides not to do something, typically they're taking a stance on an issue. But we're going to look at some of government's actions as it relates to a number of different topic areas. So let's look at those. The first one dates back prior to the civil rights movement here in Birmingham, but it's particularly important for shaping the landscape of African Americans and their abilities to advance in a number of different areas in our society. And that's the National Housing Act of 1964. This is what's recognized as creating or as the origins of the Federal Housing Administration, right? This is what gives people, or this was the attempt by FDR through the New Deal to make sure that people had adequate housing. We had a lot of issues prior to when it came down to housing development, adequate housing, quality of housing. And so the origins of those date back to 1934. What's particularly important to note when we look at this particular act, right, is that this was intended to improve the quality of life as it relates to housing. But 1934, we're talking about a sector, a large demographic of the population who were essentially excluded when we talk about housing standards and conditions. Also, I thought I had a copy of it with me. I may not have it, but it's recognized in a really great read from Richard Rothstein from 2017, which is called The Color of Law. And in that, he talks about the segregation of a number of how America was segregated largely by laws that were instituted by government. And what he talks about is this idea of redlining. And essentially what we saw dating back to 1934 was that we were trying to improve housing standards, improve housing conditions for Americans. But at that particular time, this law, when we talk about FHA, really was a way to refuse to insure mortgages for African Americans. And that was translated into subsidizing builders of subdivisions and saying, we're only going to give you this money to build these subdivisions, but for whites only, right? So we're talking about, we're starting to see exclusion from or for these particular groups of African Americans. So that one is particularly important, but dating back to 1934, housing development. Additionally, there are two other major pieces of legislation that relate back to housing or relate back to inequalities that African Americans have faced. And the first one is the Service Member Readjustment Act. This is what we all know as the GI Bill, right? It's probably something, whether you realize it or not, maybe not directly affected you, but someone you know, right, has been able to benefit from the GI Bill. It's great, right? But let's talk about the origins of the GI Bill from 1944. It provided federal aid to veterans. It was all about how can we reacclimate these members of our armed forces, the military branches, back into civilian society. And so what it focused on were a number of different things, but particularly our discussion today, it was an attempt to do so in the areas of housing and how can we address unemployment benefits. And so there was this concerted effort to try to, again, provide federal aid, provide federal assistance for these groups. But what it interestingly did is that it originally denied Black veterans these home loans as well as job opportunities. It did also, today we see many that are able to benefit from the GI Bill, but at its original, from its origins, what we also see is that it would offer federal aid in regards to higher education, but 1944, we're talking about, right, not all institutions are open. So we hadn't even started to talk about this discussion about integration. And so what that meant is that oftentimes many African Americans that were able, if they were at all able to benefit from the GI Bill, they were only going to historically Black colleges and universities and so forth. Also, the second piece of legislation, so remember, kind of at the center of this discussion, we're talking about the major public problem as highlighted through the civil rights movement of 1963 here in Birmingham. So what we do see here prior to, from the National Housing Act of 34 up to about 10 years later, the GI Bill of 44, we are starting to see discussion about how can we address housing as well as unemployment issues. But again, we're talking about some exclusions in place. And then it wasn't until the Fair Housing Act of 68 was passed. This is also what we know as the Civil Rights Act of 68, which was signed by President LBJ. And this was really aimed at trying to address these issues that African Americans and other minorities or marginalized groups were facing as it related to the housing market or when it came to buying or renting a home. So let's continue to talk about another topic that's very closely related to housing development, and that is of economic development. Economic development can be summed up by three main goals. The first one is attracting new businesses. So what there is an attempt by government, that could be federal government. Well, typically, let's keep it localized. State of Alabama. I don't know how many of you even realize that the Vance plant where Mercedes, it wasn't always there. I remember as a kid, there were being discussions and we issued out millions of dollars in incentives to get Mercedes-Benz here. And so that is what we call smokestack chasing, right? It's kind of this idea, well, what can we do to lure these businesses in? Great for a community, right? You're talking about jobs, all kinds of opportunities. So that's one focus of economic development. The second one, once you got these businesses here, economic development really focuses on how can we retain these businesses? We want to keep them here. We just offer them millions of dollars in incentives. We don't want them to go. So then we go to the drawing board. We're developing all kinds of strategies to keep those businesses in our community. Because again, this is about jobs. This is about increasing quality of life. So you see a number of different areas that are impacted. And then the last one, where a lot of attention and focus today is on, is creating new business opportunities in a communities. This is where you're starting to see a lot more discussion about these innovative think tanks, and we're starting to think beyond the box of your traditional smokestack chasing, investing in human capital, making sure that universities have what resources they need, whether that be a four-year college or partnering up with some of your two-year institutions as well. So it's about creating a business climate where not just businesses, but the right people will be interested in locating to that community. So those are the three purposes or the three focuses of economic development. Well, what does that mean today, the results of that? So typically what we see as a result of these initiatives to get businesses into a community, urban renewal, right? Where we're trying to find ways to beautify, to help strengthen these different communities, green spaces, right? All of these things. One of the ones that I do want to take some time and to focus on here is that of gentrification and displacement, because oftentimes when we think about economic development, we think about jobs, 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 but depending on where those businesses are located, that's largely going to shape the lives of certain people. That means we got to have land, right? We've got to have housing. We have to have all these resources that these businesses need. And so oftentimes, as I'll show here in the next slide, when we're talking about economic development, one of what could potentially be a negative implications of it is that it leads to gentrification as well as displacement, right? Because we're trying to beautify these areas, but that means that new people are moving in. We're creating these very beautiful, accommodating, mixed income housing, but then you've got sometimes if it's not mixed income, then oftentimes what could happen is that you have a sector of the population, particularly lower income individuals, that unfortunately get displaced. And so it becomes, it imposes some hardships on them. So let's look at an example of what I'm kind of talking about here. So probably no debate or discussion when we talk about housing and economic development that Birmingham Southtown right down the road was something that needed to be demolished, right, in terms of quality housing. But the concern comes here, and I'm using it, Birmingham as an example, but it's not the only one. I could tell you of a number of ones in Chicago and a number of other cities. But typically what happens is that we have these public housing facilities that are demolished. And if we don't have this sector of the population involved in the conversations about where they can go and what opportunities can be afforded to them, then they lose out and they could potentially be displaced. And so what we see here is that there's a proposal. This is just an illustration of the proposal for the new Southtown mixed use development right here in Birmingham. But again, there are some issues when we talk about gentrification, where those poor urban areas of a community drastically or dramatically get changed. So that could lead to change in the character of the neighborhood. And again, it can be a good thing if that area was ridden with crime or housing quality was poor, but this is an implication. Well, let's talk about transportation policies as well. When you think about housing, it's almost impossible to talk about housing without talking about economic development, without talking about transportation policies. Interestingly, the Federal Aid Highway Act, which we all know that created the U.S. interstate system, dates back to 1956, signed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's known as the greatest public works project in American history. And it was really an attempt to deal with unsafe roads, routes, and traffic issues. But what we'll see here through this illustration is that it can potentially lead to concerns in a community. Okay.
Important question is not where the automobiles come from, but how they're going to get where they're trying to go.
If you travel along, particularly South Fairmont Avenue, you'll see some very old live oak trees, which are emblematic of New Orleans. The point is that is one of the things that was destroyed by the salt fair. And so the expressway was destroying this black community as it stayed through the heart of the Faubourg Treme. Also, it's expressed of a broader sense of attempting to take back areas of the city that were largely black areas and repurpose them in such a way as to be of greater service to white people.
So highway construction decimated African American neighborhoods in cities throughout the nation. Under the Interstate Highway Act, highway construction was coordinated with another federal program of slum clearance.
The thing that people usually say, these were dying communities, and we needed the overpasses, we needed the highways to move people out of these ghetto environments. Well, in fact, these were communities that were vibrant, that people were living in, that the United States government destroyed through a combination of active funding of detrimental projects and a kind of benign neglect.
They created this very kind of rigid method of categorizing neighborhoods as either very desirable or very undesirable. And the primary criteria for this system was race. That is to say that if a particular neighborhood had even one African American living in that neighborhood was immediately designated as a risk, and it was coded in the color red, and that's where we get the term redlining from. Highway construction impacted Black communities or other non-white communities because that's where property values were the lowest. There is a certain kind of cost-effective strategy in building highways through neighborhoods with lower property values. It costs the state less. However, historically, lower property values have been tied to race and African Americans in particular. In many ways, all of these federal policies and programs were interconnected. Federal Housing Administration's policies, urban renewal, slum clearance, highway construction, all of these processes worked in tandem with each other to create an even more racially stratified geography.
Okay, thank you. Stop sharing. Okay. Go back. It's just a little delayed. So in keeping with that, I wanted to show that illustration because those three major topic areas are closely intertwined and interrelated. So let's talk about some other topics that have occurred and some other policy issues that have been addressed post the civil rights movement here in Birmingham, 1963. The first one is that of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed by LBJ, and this was really aimed to address these legal barriers that prevented African Americans from voting. Now, we know that the origins of voting rights date back to the 15th Amendment, 1870. However, that did not mean that African Americans weren't ways in place to restrict or prevent them from exercising these rights. And also keep in mind, 1870 with the 15th Amendment, we're talking exclusion of women as well as at that time. So more recently, I thought it was very interesting. I was looking through some reports and found that the Government Accountability Office, from the most recent report that they published 2017, have actually found that Black voter registration has increased since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. However, when we look at it, we've only got about 1% of elected officials that are actually Black. In the US Congress, that's not quite 55 from the House and from the Senate. And we also continue to see concerns when it relates back to voting rights issues. And again, I'm talking federal government here, still concerns about voter suppression through early voting or questions about that, mail-in voting, and then even voter ID requirements, which is something that when we talk about rural isolated communities, really becomes a complicated issue when you're looking at that particular sector of the population. So let's talk about some more modern topics related to policies that affect African Americans. Let's talk about criminal justice policies, particularly criminal justice reform. Found this quote from President Clinton from 1994 in his State of the Union address. Those who commit crime should be punished, and those who commit repeated violent crimes should be told that you will be put away and put away for good. 3 strikes and you're out. So the origins of the 3 strikes you're out bill. That was extremely confrontational. It was particularly important because what we see is that most of these offenses, particularly when we talk about the narrow line of crimes that were connected here, really, even though it excluded nonviolent crimes and drug crimes and petty theft, we're talking about a large sector of the African-American population that was impacted. Building on to this discussion here, this was really an attempt to kind of push us into a new direction with this 3 strikes you're out law. And it was really an attempt to increase the number of police officers, add additional funding, but the yields and the impacts were concerning. I'm going to check this just to make sure. Oh, they still see the highway ramp.
Okay, so because they mess okay, do it different.
Okay, got it. They mentioned that they could see it. Okay, great. So again, this was one attempt of 1994. Also, more recently with the Black Lives Matter movement, this is more of a grassroots effort, but it does show that citizens are pushing for this as a topic of discussion to be addressed by government, particularly as it relates to racism and police brutality. Well, let's talk about something, and I want to end here when we talk about workplace discrimination policy, something that I'm very familiar with my work with human resource management. What is particularly important here when we talk about workplace discrimination, talking about employment policies in general. And really at the heart of this is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is really the comprehensive federal legislation where the federal government says, this is our aim, this is our attempt to address discrimination in the workplace. And it was all about how can we promote equal opportunity in the workplace. So Title VII is kind of the key of that, the centerfold. But in addition to that, this is where we also find, we refer to these as kind of the big 3 workplace discrimination policies. Adding to that is the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 67, and then the Americans with Disability Act. So what does Title VII actually say? This is the language that we find, right? This is where the federal government establishes, we have a national policy as it relates to color, race, national origin, religion, and sex, and so forth, making it unlawful for an employer to retaliate against someone who's complained, who says that they want to file a charge or participate even as a witness to a discrimination complaint. Now, in addition to that, so we have the federal government taking a stance with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 64, and then this gets extended a bit further. As I mentioned before, we talk about federal legislation is being passed by Congress, but in addition to that, this is another executive order that we see. Executive Order 11246, this was instituted by President LBJ, and this was the attempt to improve employment as well as educational opportunities for African Americans and other protected groups or protected classes in our society. Now, for the purpose of our discussion, I want to focus on race, color, religion, and national origin, but knowing when President Obama got into place, he did include other protected groups. But we're talking about affirmative action plans. What does that mean? So the government's saying we're going to make a stake and we're going to say that from a national standpoint, discrimination in the workplace is unacceptable. So the federal government's attempt to do so, or to kind of push that, was where they went in and required all federal contractors, if you're receiving $50,000 or more in federal contracts and federal funds, you have to put into place an affirmative action plan, which means, right, not a quota system, but that means goals, timelines, to have an idea about what your workforce looks like, in comparison to the general demographics of society. So that's the idea there. So doesn't look really clear here, but when we're talking about workplace discrimination, it's important to know this is probably one of the most comprehensive policies as it relates to addressing injustices for African Americans, but because it applies to just about every area of employment. We're talking about hiring, we're firing, we're talking about training, we're talking about testing, transfers, promotions, benefits. All of those protected classes, when we talk about race, national origin and ethnicity, those are the different areas where those protections are provided. And then it's not very clear here, and I can show this, but this is you've probably seen it in your break room somewhere. This is the Know Your Laws poster, and it's actually gotten changed here. But this is just to kind of sum up the federal government's stance against discrimination in the workplace, and it lists out all those different categorizations. The other side of this, and what we're beginning to see now today, is this real true discussion about DEI, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the workforce. So what I think that really shows us is that when we're talking about dealing with injustices or policies, the federal government has taken more effort and more stance to address these concerns. Since President Biden has been in office, he signed into place Executive Order 14035, which really makes the call for further promoting this idea of promoting diversity. And the important thing to note here is that when we talk about diversity and why it's important, it's recognizing that, particularly since the federal government is the largest employer in our nation, if we want to remain competitive, that means that we have to deal with and address these issues surrounding discrimination, injustices, and inequalities in our society. And this illustration just kind of sums up and shows us all of this. It's not as clear here, but I've got another graphic to show if we want to take a look at it. And it's more about the strategic plan and the specific steps that the federal government has begun to initiate to support this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as accessibility and even belonging, but the federal government's language of DEIA in the workplace. And so in sum, when we look here, we do see that although African Americans have been able to advance, and so many of these laws, things have been put into place to try to open opportunities for not just African Americans, but for all marginalized or protected classes, protected groups in America. What we do see when we look here at the national total averages, national earning disparities relative to white workers, we do see that African Americans still earn less than that dollar for whites. And then when we look even here with the Alabama averages, we still see here it's a little bit lower, where African Americans are only earning about 74 cents to every dollar that that whites are earning. So in sum, when we talk about a number of these different issues, it's important to note that African Americans have played a very integral role in our society. And when we talk about public policy, keep in mind that's government's response to these public problems, public issues that we're facing. There are a number of different factors that inform and shape public policy, some of those that we looked at here today. What is also important to know, and I think what is encouraging, even though there's debate and discussion about DEIA, is that as societal demands grow regarding these different topics, these injustices, so will the need for government's response to these issues. So thank you for your time, and I'll end there and open the floor for questions. And I'll try to keep an eye out here too. I don't know if they'll have questions. Ozzy, you want to ask your question?
Yeah. When or what drove the board's decision to change Black History Week so much?
Well, a lot of it was societal demands, right? Recognizing those injustices. He had just been put into office. And so it was really kind of response to societal demands and what was taking place at that time.
Question was, with the economic developments, the three goals, the first goal was to attract new businesses.
Mhm.
But this was specifically attracting new white businesses maybe, or?
Well, no, this is just when we're talking about economic development, just generally speaking, right? That's just kind of the way that we frame that whole discussion.
I guess I was asking in respect to Tulsa, because they had a thriving like Black Wall Street, but that was literally scorched.
Yes.
Because they just didn't want to see that progress happen.
Yes, great point there. I wouldn't categorize it into blacks versus white when I'm thinking about, that's just kind of the frame of reference, like the theoretical frame that we use to talk about those different strategies. So not just based on race, but go question. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, what do you think is some of the most important policies to focus on in order to achieve equity in our country?
Well, I ended there with the DEI discussion. I think that those are important, right? When the federal government makes an effort to address those and, making a stance, this is our national policy. I think that that's the most important. But it can't end there, right? So states have to act, local governments have to act as well. And so I think taking the lead and, making a concerted effort to respond is important, but that also means that other levels of government have to respond as well. Great question. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. This has been really nice. Touching on that question, I guess, going off of it, how do you get states to respond in this federal system that we live in, and get them to cooperate with the federal government?
I'll propose that to students. Well, the initial thing is to do what? Go out and what? Vote, right? Make your voice be known. That's what we talk about, right? That's the most basic principle of our democracy. That's one way to do it. But I'll open that up to others as well. What are some ways in which that's kind of the most obvious? I mean, contacting your legislator, letting them know that these are issues of concern. We're seeing in the field of public administration, we're seeing a lot more work and a lot more groundwork from nonprofits as well, right? So them mobilizing and making those issues heard to the masses is important as well too. So I'd add that, but I'd open that up to anyone as well. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your talk. It's really exciting to know that you were coming back and that you still want to take place. So thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask you about the pay gap and gave the disparities, the 70% to the dollar. And I was just curious to know with regards to intersectionality and Black women, for example, and Latinx women, just if you had a breakdown, but I know those numbers are lower than I don't think this.
Yes.
I was just curious to know
Yes, so the reason why I actually included those statistics was because OFCC provides it to make a national versus a state comparison, but there's a lot of data. I don't have those with me. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes that quarterly, I know. And so I do know that there are pay discrepancies. I didn't even get into that, but yes, that intersectionality component is definitely important. But I do know that BLS does report that data at least quarterly. So yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
I actually have someone who has a comment.
Oh, okay.
On speaker.
Okay.
Good to hear. Go ahead, Dr. Rosler.
Oh, can you hear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, hi, how are you?
Well, and you.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. I'd like to just make a little comment on, when you were talking about the GI Bill,
Yes, ma'am.
because that's something that personally affected me. My father was a World War II veteran, and, even though a lot of veterans did not get, they could not take advantage of that bill. In New Orleans, in fact, they did. In fact, I think Richard Rothstein, and is it The Color of Law that he wrote?
Yes, ma'am.
He talks about the situation, but he doesn't mention the community. It was called Pontchartrain.
Okay.
Right on the south shore of Lake Pontchartrain. And I remember because I was a little girl, the day my father and mother signed the contract for the property. But what happened was this, the mayor at that time, I think it was Shapiro, but I don't remember, made a deal with the Black realtor that they would have to have a segregated community of Black people,
Mhm.
and then the one in Gentilly Woods would be for white people.
Right.
What, of course, we didn't know then, and I know now, you know, as an older adult, that that area should never have been developed. Because when Katrina happened, it was inundated. And the thing is, that was the flatland, so the lake that should never have been developed. And so we can see how, even though it looked like it was an advantage for Black people, in fact, it was not. And then that's the kind of politics that was played around with, you know, and that and urban renewal as well. I know Claiborne Avenue, we used to go up and down that area while this Oak Trees were. And that was a beautiful neighborhood from way back in the French colonial tradition, where you had Black homeowners and things. All that was like the way. So even though it looked like you may have, you know, taken advantage of it, benefited from it, in fact, we did not.
You are very much correct. Thank you for those comments. You brought up a really great point. I didn't show a video. There's a really small clip that talks about the GI Bill, and how in that illustration, the guests talk about how that was really the government's opportunity to kind of leverage things and to address some of these inequalities as it relates to African Americans and whites. However, they just didn't capitalize on that, just jump on that opportunity. But as you were mentioning as well with the housing, he does talk about that in The Color of Law, and how oftentimes, you know, it's specified that you can build, but right. So these neighborhoods, these subdivisions have to be segregated. And so it was problematic. And where these subdivision, where these houses get built, rebuilt, moved, relocated, that largely shapes the lives and the quality of lives for African Americans as well. Yes. Thank you. Others, yes, ma'am.
What do you think it would take for governmental policies to, you know, we know Seneca Village happened, we know Black Wall Street happened, you know, all these communities have been displaced, burned down. So what do you think would take the government to actually right the wrongs of the past? I mean, it created redlining these impoverished neighborhoods, as the woman just said, Professor de Seven Paul. You know, they created communities in spaces where they knew that this was a devastating area. It was not going to be viable to live there. So how do we get government? I mean, they're disregarding CRT. They don't want to talk about history. They don't want to acknowledge what happened in the past. So we have all these issues that are present today and they're because of the past. So is there anything policy wise that federally that can be done to force them to? Force their hand to?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't, because I think it's more complicated. It shouldn't be, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than it should be. But I acknowledge that it is something, and like you're saying, it's woven into so many other aspects of life for African Americans. I don't know whose hand was up first, but go ahead.
Do you think like environmental rights would be an approach that government would take to address some of these inequalities that exist between, especially in marginalized communities?
Yes, very much so. So we're starting to see a lot, depending on where the communities are. When always think about the movie Erin Brockovich, right, and what it was attempting to do, right? So there have been numbers of communities. I can tell you some right here in Alabama who have struggled with those same issues as it relates to, you know, some of these environmental injustices. And really what we've seen are grassroots approaches to getting these issues on the agenda before they kind of move through. So yes, but that's definitely one approach to dealing with those. But great question, Liza.
I took Dr. Hope's urban politics class, so we looked at the color of law. And I guess one question I've ever had since that class was, I know a lot of these policies, especially like the urban policies, were passed in collaboration with the New Deal, and so they just all kind of came out, like flooded out.
Mhm.
But do you think that the legislators, or even the president at the time, knew the impacts that this legislation would have on Black communities, even if it was intentionally racist in a way, or discriminatory?
Maybe and maybe not. I don't know. And he asked at the end, I was reading through that, he tries to look at that question and tries to evaluate it. And I don't honestly know the answer to it. But like you said, it was government's response, right? We've got these issues. And so it was just kind of I always make mention, I think I mentioned in class to you all, that government is reactive, right? So we've got an issue and then respond. And then oftentimes we sit back and we look. And bureaucrats, right? We're just expected to do the job, but then we have time and reflect and we look back and we're like, oh, wow, look at how that's impacted, you know, so many different groups. So I think time will, you know, unfortunately tell, and it has told over time, but I don't know, some of those maybe, you know, then, but a lot of it is just over the course of time.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe like that it was like a political decision because the party could not get a bill to pass unless they
For which,
did the GI.
yes. And I wish I had shown you all that other little clip, but yes. Yeah, there was a lot of discussion about that and you know, getting it passed itself, but yes. Largely controversial. Other questions? Trying to keep an eye on on Zoom as well to see if we have any others. If not, I thank you all for your time and for engaging in this discussion with me, and again to IHR.
you.
I appreciate you all for extending the invitation to me. Thank you all.
Thank you all on Zoom land. Our next speaker event will be on Monday at 4 p.m. That will be Mr. Barry McNeely on Black Resistance, Battle of Birmingham, Alabama. And it will also be offered via Zoom. Thank you.